On February 18th, 2024, Houthi forces launched 2 anti-ship ballistic missiles into the Red Sea towards the Belize-flagged and British-owned bulk carrier MV Rubimar. One of these missiles struck the Rubimar and caused flooding in the ship's engine room and forced the crew to abandon ship, and they were successfully rescued without casualties. The attack is the closest the Houthis have come to sinking a ship so far, and the most damaging attack since a severe fire was started on the Marlin Luanda in January. In this video, I plan to cover the major events and updates since the last time I talked about the Red Sea crisis, and look at the overall impact of the crisis. Since the US first launched retaliatory strikes on Houthi forces, attacks in the Red Sea have continued. U.S. forces have shifted from a purely defensive role in downing Houthi missiles and drones to switching to a limited offensive role, with the U.S. preemptively striking Houthi missile and drone launchers before they can fire their ordnance. The strikes have hit dozens of targets, primarily drones, anti-ship missiles, and anti-ship ballistic missiles, and in addition, there have been several days where the US and occasionally Britain have launched larger-scale attacks since the initial January 12 strikes. This includes January 17th, when 14 Houthi targets were attacked, January 22nd, when 8 targets were hit, February 1st, when 11 targets were struck, February 3rd, a grand total of 42 targets were attacked, February 8th and 9th, a total of 16 targets were hit, and finally, on February 19th into the 20th, the U.S. struck a SAM site and intercepted 10 UAVs and an anti-ship missile. In addition to these dates, there's been nearly daily attacks by the U.S. on Houthi targets, typically hitting at least 1 or 2 a day. They're generally launchers for missiles or drones and are spotted by U.S. surveillance and then destroyed before they can launch. Despite the volume of the U.S. strikes on the Houthis, it doesn't appear to have degraded their capabilities as their attacks continue. Since January 12th, there's been 15 attacks on commercial shipping, showing that the Houthis are neither deterred nor degraded in their capabilities. The United States has found itself engaged in the world's deadliest game of whack-a-mole. Also noted in recent strikes is that the U.S. also reported destroying an unmanned underwater vehicle, the first time one had been seen by U.S. forces, adding yet another layer of threats the Houthis can use against vessels. I'll also point out that there's a lot more going on that isn't necessarily being reported on. As part of the strikes on the Houthis on January 12th, it's also been reported that the U.S. conducted a cyber attack on the Iranian spy ship Bashad. The vessel is believed to be sharing intelligence and targeting information with Houthi forces. There's been correlation with Bashad's location and subsequent attacks in the area. Despite the calls of a bunch of randos on Twitter, the US has not, and likely won't, sink the ship. While destroying the Bashad would eliminate the spy ship's ability to direct Houthi attacks, it would represent a significant escalation with Iran. It would also cause a geopolitical firestorm internationally, not to mention political consequences at home. There is also the human costs of Iranian casualties, as well as an environmental impact of sinking the ship. To add to all of that, the Bashad is escorted by the Iranian frigate Alborz. The Alborz only has a 30mm Sea Whiz for missile defense, but does carry 8 Noor anti-ship missiles if Iran chose to try and retaliate against U.S. forces. This would present the Navy with another problem: whether to target the Alborz as well as the Bashad. The U.S. Navy could certainly eliminate both ships without much risk to their own vessels or personnel, but the issue will always be whether or not the consequences are worth the gain. In addition to things such as cyber attacks, U.S. and coalition forces have also been trying to interdict arms shipments to the Houthis. While the total extent has likely not been publicized, there are 2 that were. On January 11th, U.S. Navy SEALs boarded a dhow and discovered weapons and parts headed to Yemen. 2 SEALs were lost at sea during the operation, and the dhow was subsequently sunk. On January 28th, the U.S. Coast Guard intercepted another dhow and found a similar shipment of weapons and components as well. This operation was publicized 2 weeks after it occurred, making it likely that these aren't the only two that have happened. I now want to look at two of the most significant attacks of the crisis so far, starting with the tanker Marlin Luanda. On January 26, the Marlin Luanda was hauling naphtha, which is a petroleum product that's highly flammable. The tanker was struck by an anti-ship missile that ignited a fire on board that ultimately burned for hours. It took the combined efforts of Marlin Luanda's crew, the destroyer USS Carney, the French frigate Alsace, and an Indian destroyer to bring the flames under control. The ship was then able to continue its journey. Now to the Ruby Mar. The bulker was struck on February 18th by a Houthi anti-ship ballistic missile. The exact damage is still unknown, but based on images released on February 21st, the ship was hit towards the stern, causing heavy flooding in the engine room. The crew was forced to abandon ship, and coalition forces responded. The Ruby Mar's crew suffered no casualties, but the ship is dead in the water at this time. The ship's fate is still in question, but she's the closest the Houthis have come to sinking one. A salvage crew will likely have to make its way to the ship to repair the damage as well as they can, and then try to pump out as much water as possible before the ship can be towed somewhere that it can be repaired. It's possible that the ship could be written off as a total loss by insurance companies depending on the extent and cost of the damage. The ship could also founder depending on weather and sea conditions while it waits for temporary repairs and towing, while also still being at risk of further attack by the Houthis. Shortly after this incident, the Houthis also shot down an MQ-9 Reaper drone, which is the second time an MQ-9 has been downed since the conflict began. The efforts by the United States and their coalition allies have been unable to stop the attacks in the Red Sea, and the amount of commercial shipping traversing through the region continues to drop. How this crisis ends is anyone's guess. As long as the Israel-Hamas war rages on, the Houthis and their Iranian backers will likely continue this campaign. This attempt by the Houthis to enact a quasi-blockade on the Red Sea has presented us with a unique moment in naval history. It's seen the first use of anti-ship ballistic missiles in combat, as well as the first use of warships to escort commercial vessels since the Iran-Iraq War. It also has shown how effective relatively cheap one-way attack drones can be at achieving Iran and the Houthis' goals of disrupting commercial shipping, and the difficulty the United States has had in disrupting them. With the revelation that the Houthis now possessed unmanned underwater vehicles that seem to be similar to torpedoes, it'll be interesting to see how the US counters them if and when they're launched. For now, I'll continue to monitor any updates as they happen, but in the meantime, please like the video and I'll see you on the next one.